When you hear Triads and Yakuza, you probably picture blood-soaked streets, turf wars, and endless gang battles. But the truth? These two criminal giants didn't spend decades trying to wipe each other out. Instead, they discovered something far more valuable than revenge: profit. In a world where respect meant survival and deals meant power, the smartest move wasn't war, it was peace. The names themselves carry a chill: the Triads, the Yakuza, words that echo through alleys, neon-lit bars, and the back pages of newspapers for over a century. To the outsider, they sound like natural enemies, destined to clash in bloody turf wars, to fight endlessly for dominance across the underworld. But the truth, whispered beneath the surface, tells a different story. These two criminal empires were less interested in war than in balance, less focused on pride than on profit. And when they crossed paths, they did something few expected. They learned to coexist. The roots of the Triad stretched deep into China's past, into a time of revolution and secret brotherhoods. Born in the shadows of the 17th century, they began as patriotic societies sworn to overthrow the foreign Qing dynasty. Their rituals were shrouded in mystery: candles lit, blood spilled, oaths spoken that bound men together beyond family. They practiced hand signs, symbolic cuts across the skin, prayers to heaven that made every member a brother. But as centuries passed, their mission shifted. The dream of restoring dynasties faded, and what remained was organization, loyalty, and an instinct for power. They turned their eyes to the marketplaces, the gambling dens, the ports where money changed hands. By the 20th century, the Triads were no longer rebels. They were businessmen in the shadows, building empires through extortion, protection, smuggling, and the intoxicating lure of opium. The Yakuza emerged on the opposite shore of East Asia, born in the crowded streets of Edo, Japan. They came from the Bakuto, gamblers, and the Takiya, street peddlers who lived on the margins of society. Outcasts became clans, and clans became syndicates. Their aesthetic was unmistakable. Tattoos in swirling colors and mythic beasts stretched across their bodies, visible only in private baths and ritual gatherings. They prided themselves on hierarchy, on rigid discipline, on a strange kind of honor. The Oyabun, the boss, stood above all, and the Kobun, his children, owed him absolute loyalty. Their methods ranged from extortion rackets in local markets to large-scale construction projects, and as Japan modernized, they found ways to entangle themselves in politics, finance, and the entertainment industry. To the Japanese public, they were both feared and strangely tolerated. Their offices often marked with signs, their bosses moving openly through the cities as if crime itself had its own headquarters. Two syndicates, two nations, two cultures. And yet, when the 20th century brought them face to face, the world did not witness the apocalyptic battles it expected. Instead, there was calculation. The Triads and the Yakuza recognized something familiar in each other: discipline, hierarchy, codes of respect, and the eternal hunger for wealth. They saw reflections of themselves across the water, and predators, when they recognize each other, rarely fight to the death without reason. Their first true points of contact came in the bustling ports of Hong Kong, Shanghai, and later Tokyo. The ports were not only gateways for legitimate trade, but arteries of the underworld: narcotics, gambling revenues, counterfeit goods. These all flowed through ships and containers that moved faster than any police force could track. Hong Kong in particular, with its British administration and its unique position as the crossroads of East and West, became a meeting ground. Here, Triad bosses held sway over entire districts, while Yakuza emissaries came seeking opportunity. The outsiders expected conflict, but the meetings often ended with handshakes, not blood. There is an old saying, war is bad for business, and nowhere was this more true than in the shadow economies of Asia. Violence drew attention, and attention invited police crackdowns, media scrutiny, and chaos that scared away customers. Profit required quiet. It required markets that could flow uninterrupted, supply chains that were smooth, and operations that remained invisible to the public eye. A bloody feud between the Triads and the Yakuza would not enrich either side. It would destroy them both. So, they chose a different path. The 1960s and 1970s marked a turning point. The Golden Triangle, that rugged borderland between Thailand, Laos, and Myanmar, became the epicenter of the world's heroin trade. Remote, lawless, and rich with opium poppies, it offered fortune to anyone who could move the product out to international markets. The Triads had the supply lines, the connections with the farmers and the smugglers who could carry raw opium down rivers and across mountains. The Yakuza, meanwhile, had the distribution networks, the foothold in Japan's massive urban centers, and eventually the links to international shipping routes that could deliver narcotics to Europe and the United States. What might have been a turf war instead became a quiet arrangement. The Triads controlled the source. The Yakuza helped move it. Each respected the other's domain. Neither side trusted blindly, but both understood that cooperation meant untold riches. A kilogram of heroin moved from the hills of Myanmar to the streets of Tokyo or Los Angeles could yield profits far beyond anything a turf battle would achieve. And so, they dealt not as friends, but as business partners. Picture a room in 1980s Hong Kong, smoke curling toward the ceiling, the air heavy with the scent of cigarettes and tension. On one side of the table sits a Triad lieutenant, sleeves rolled to reveal faded scars, eyes sharp with suspicion. Across from him is a Yakuza negotiator, immaculate in a tailored suit, tattoos hidden beneath white cuffs. Neither man smiles. Neither man dares to show weakness. But between them lies a map. Shipping lanes, air routes, coded notes about customs officers who can be bribed and dock workers who can be trusted. The silence breaks only with the scrape of a pen signing an agreement. No newspapers will ever report this deal. No historian will record the names. But the handshake seals an alliance worth millions. Outside the room, Hong Kong hums with life, oblivious to the fact that its nightclubs, ports, and casinos have just become part of a grander arrangement. Respect was the currency that made these arrangements possible. Both the Triads and the Yakuza valued face, the idea that reputation was everything. To dishonor a deal, to break a truce, was to invite humiliation and weakness was fatal in the underworld. So long as each side honored their word, the uneasy peace held. Disputes, when they arose, were often solved through intermediaries, through negotiation, through the careful balancing act that allowed both sides to save face while protecting their profits. This is not to say violence disappeared. The underworld always had its casualties, its assassinations, its brutal warnings carved into the bodies of the disloyal, but those acts were usually inward, targeted at defectors, rivals within their own organizations, or outsiders who threatened the balance. Rarely did the Triads and the Yakuza unleash open warfare against each other. They understood that such a war would scorch the very ground they depended upon. By the late 20th century, their cooperation had extended beyond drugs. Macau's casinos, Hong Kong's construction industry, Tokyo's entertainment districts all became meeting points where money could be laundered, investments made, and new schemes born. The Yakuza, with their ability to infiltrate legitimate industries, offered cover and infrastructure. The Triads, with their global reach into Chinatowns and diaspora communities, provided access to new markets. Together, they were less like rival armies and more like multinational corporations, forming joint ventures in the shadows. And yet, the truce was never easy. Beneath the surface lay suspicion, cultural differences, and the constant threat of betrayal. Each organization knew the other could turn, that peace was a strategy, not a promise. The silence between them was filled with calculation, each handshake accompanied by the knowledge that the hand could one day hold a blade. But the profits were too rich, the stakes too high, to throw it away for pride. Think again of that phrase, war is bad for business. For these syndicates, business was survival. It was the lifeblood that kept their families, their soldiers, their entire worlds alive. To throw that away for the sake of a feud would not have been bravery. It would have been stupidity. And in the underworld, stupidity was punished more quickly than weakness. Thus, the great war between the Triads and the Yakuza never truly came. There were skirmishes, whispers of rivalries, moments of tension that nearly spilled over. But the full-scale battles that Hollywood might imagine, the bloody showdowns of myth and legend, were rare. What endured instead was an uneasy, calculated peace. A peace held together not by trust, but by the simple, ruthless arithmetic of profit. Tonight, as we pull back the curtain on their story, we find not just criminals, but strategists. Men who understood that money could build empires where bullets only destroyed them. Men who chose silence over blood, respect over insult, profit over war. And in that choice lies a lesson about power, that sometimes the deadliest syndicates are not the ones who fight the most, but the ones who know when not to fight at all. The uneasy peace between the Triads and the Yakuza was never a friendship. It was a calculation, a pact written not in ink but in silence, where each side knew the other's strengths and weaknesses and decided it was safer to coexist. But every peace, even one born from profit, must withstand tests. As the 1980s bled into the 1990s, the underworld shifted. Governments tightened laws. Police forces adapted, markets rose and collapsed. And within the shadows, both syndicates faced choices that would either strengthen their truce or tempt them back into violence. By the early 1980s, heroin was the golden river flowing out of Southeast Asia. The Golden Triangle produced a supply so vast that it fed addicts from Bangkok to Brooklyn. Triad networks handled much of the sourcing, working with warlords and rebel groups who controlled poppy fields deep in jungles where no government dared to march. From crude laboratories, bricks of high-grade heroin were packed into trucks, carried across borders, hidden inside cargo crates. These shipments moved along routes watched by soldiers with no loyalty except to whoever paid the most. The Triads became masters of this web, greasing palms from the Mekong River to the ports of Hong Kong. For the Yakuza, Japan's growing wealth offered the perfect market. By the 1980s, Tokyo was a city of neon and excess, its economy booming, its nightclubs stuffed with cash. Demand for drugs rose quietly, and the Yakuza were poised to control distribution. They did not always soil their hands directly. Instead, they operated through layers of front companies and loyal intermediaries. The heroin arrived hidden in shipments of textiles or electronics, slipping through customs officers who had long been on syndicate payrolls. Once inside Japan, it was broken down into smaller parcels, sold through networks of dealers who feared the Yakuza's discipline more than the police. It was here that the Triads and Yakuza struck their most delicate balance. The Triads could have tried to push into Japanese distribution, but they understood the risks. The Yakuza ruled the streets, the clubs, the brothels. Any attempt to bypass them would have sparked war. The Yakuza, in turn, could have tried to undercut the Triad supply lines, but the jungles of Myanmar and Laos were not their territory. They lacked the connections, the bribes, the cultural knowledge that the Triads had cultivated for decades. And so, like merchants at opposite ends of a Silk Road, they respected the lanes of control. Supply was Chinese, distribution was Japanese, and the money poured in. The arrangement might have seemed invisible to the public, but whispers spread. In Hong Kong, rumors circulated of Yakuza men frequenting Triad-controlled clubs, their suits immaculate, their tattoos hidden beneath crisp collars. In Tokyo, sharp-eyed observers noted the sudden availability of pure heroin, its origins traced not to local gangs, but to shipments from across the sea. To the governments watching, it was a nightmare. Cooperation between the two most powerful syndicates in Asia meant law enforcement was no longer facing isolated groups, but networks that crossed oceans. The Americans were among the first to take notice. The DEA had already been fighting a losing battle against heroin shipments into the United States, and intelligence reports began to suggest that both Chinese and Japanese syndicates were playing a role. In response, task forces were formed, agents dispatched to Hong Kong and Tokyo, but infiltrating either the Triads or the Yakuza was nearly impossible. Their structures were built on loyalty, on family bonds sealed by ritual. Outsiders rarely made it past the first layer of foot soldiers. To penetrate deeper was to risk discovery, and discovery meant death. Still, the governments pressed on. In Hong Kong, the Independent Commission Against Corruption tried to root out the Triads' hold over police and customs officers. In Japan, the government passed new anti-Yakuza laws designed to strip the syndicates of their legitimacy and freeze their assets. Raids were carried out. Nightclubs were shut down. Public campaigns urged citizens to resist the lure of organized crime. But for every door closed, another opened. The Triads shifted more of their operations overseas, relying on the Chinese diaspora in North America, Australia, and Europe to move their product. The Yakuza diversified, investing in real estate, finance, and even technology companies to launder their profits. Despite these pressures, their cooperation did not collapse. Instead, it adapted. When heroin routes grew too dangerous, new commodities took their place. Counterfeit goods, pirated electronics, weapons, and later methamphetamines became part of the trade. The Triads were quick to exploit China's booming factories, producing counterfeit luxury goods that flooded global markets. The Yakuza, with their established shipping channels, moved those goods with ease. Once again, the formula repeated itself. The Chinese controlled production. The Japanese managed distribution. And once again, the peace held. But peace in the underworld is always fragile. Beneath the surface, tensions simmered. Some triad bosses resented what they saw as the Yakuza's arrogance, their belief that Japan's syndicates were more sophisticated, more disciplined. Some Yakuza leaders whispered that the Triads were unpredictable, too chaotic, too willing to betray for profit. There were incidents, small clashes in Macau's casinos, arguments over smuggling fees, disputes about territory in Southeast Asia. Knives were drawn, fists thrown, blood spilled in alleyways that never made the papers. Yet, even in these moments, cooler heads prevailed. Leaders from both sides knew the cost of escalation. They intervened, mediated, reminded their men that killing a rival might feel satisfying, but it risked millions in lost revenue, and so the feuds were smothered before they could ignite. It was not just money that held the truce together. It was also respect. Both organizations understood ritual, hierarchy, and the weight of a promise. A deal made in a smoky backroom was not just a business contract. It was a matter of honor. To break it would mean losing face, and losing face was more dangerous than losing money. For the Triads, bound by centuries of oaths and blood rituals, and for the Yakuza, who demanded loyalty to the Oyabun above all, reputation was the invisible glue that bound them. Neither side could afford to be seen as untrustworthy. As the century turned, the world changed again. Hong Kong returned to Chinese rule in 1997, reshaping the power of the Triads. Japan's economy slowed after its bubble burst, forcing the Yakuza to adapt to leaner years. Globalization brought new opportunities, cybercrime, human trafficking, international fraud, but also new risks. As law enforcement became more connected, intelligence shared more quickly across borders. The shadowy peace between the Triads and the Yakuza faced new tests. Yet even here, the same logic prevailed. Where one had supply, the other had demand. Where one had connections, the other had roots. And together, they remained stronger than if they fought apart. In the end, their story is not one of endless bloodshed, but of restraint. They did not lay down arms out of kindness. They did it because they understood the cold arithmetic of survival. A war between them would have left both sides broken, their empires shattered by police raids and hungry rivals. By choosing peace, they preserved not only their profits, but their legacies. The Triads endured, their influence stretching from Hong Kong to Vancouver to Sydney. The Yakuza survived, their fingerprints on industries both illicit and legitimate across Japan. Their uneasy alliance, unspoken and fragile, remains one of the underworld's most enduring truths. Think of it this way. History remembers kings and generals for the wars they fought, but in the shadows, the Triads and Yakuza are remembered for the war they never fought, the one they avoided because they knew that money, respect, and power flowed more easily in silence than in blood. And so their legend lingers, not as enemies locked in battle, but as rivals who understood that sometimes the sharpest blade is the one left in its sheath. The fragile truce between the Triads and the Yakuza held longer than anyone might have predicted, but peace in the underworld is never eternal. Every alliance, no matter how profitable, must face the weight of time, betrayal, and the shifting tides of history. For two syndicates born from centuries-old traditions, the late 20th and early 21st centuries brought storms that would test the foundations of their quiet arrangement. It began, as it so often does in crime, with greed. In the late 1990s, as heroin routes grew riskier and global law enforcement increased coordination, whispers began to circulate of triad factions who wanted more. Some saw Japan not as a partner's territory, but as a lucrative market waiting to be seized. In Tokyo, reports surfaced of Chinese dealers operating without Yakuza blessing, small crews selling heroin directly to addicts in Shinjuku and Shibuya. These incursions were not large-scale operations, but they carried meaning. To the Yakuza, every street corner was sacred, every nightclub a domain under their control. Even the smallest encroachment felt like an insult. The response was swift. Dealers disappeared. Bodies were found in alleys, throats slit, fingers missing, messages carved into flesh. These were warnings, not declarations of war. The Yakuza wanted the Triads to understand. Distribution in Japan was not negotiable. For a moment, the peace trembled. The knife-edge balance threatened to tip. But cooler voices within the Triads reined their hot-blooded factions back. Japan was not worth a war. The profits were greater when the old arrangement was respected. And so, the truce endured, though not without scars. While the Triads tested boundaries in Japan, the Yakuza faced their own temptations abroad. In Hong Kong and Macau, the gambling industry grew into a gold mine. Casinos became laundromats for criminal money, turning dirty profits into clean chips and cash. The Triads dominated these spaces, their control over Macau almost absolute. Yet Yakuza men began appearing at the tables, laundering money of their own, and rumors swirled of Japanese investors tied to syndicate bosses buying stakes in casino projects. The Triads bristled. The gaming dens of Macau were their bloodline, their inheritance, and the presence of outsiders, even respected ones, felt like trespass. Still, war never came. Instead, backroom conversations resolved the tensions. Triads permitted limited Yakuza activity, provided it did not threaten their dominance. The Yakuza accepted the compromise, satisfied to dip into Macau's rivers of money without challenging its rulers. Once again, profit proved stronger than pride. But governments were learning. By the early 2000s, both China and Japan recognized that allowing powerful syndicates to flourish unchecked would erode their authority. China, eager to showcase its rising strength, cracked down on Triads with brutal efficiency. Police raids swept through Hong Kong and Guangzhou, arrests numbering in the hundreds. High-profile bosses were paraded before cameras, their empires seized, their influence curtailed. In Japan, a series of anti-Yakuza laws stripped syndicates of their quasi-legal protections. Banks froze their accounts. Companies were forbidden from doing business with them. And police pressure intensified. For the first time in decades, both syndicates found themselves weakened. This created a paradox. On one hand, pressure from governments fractured their power, making large-scale cooperation more difficult. On the other, the shared experience of decline forced them to value their truce even more. Neither side could afford the distraction of a feud when survival itself was at stake. And so, in the shadows of this crackdown, the Triads and Yakuza clung to their arrangement like survivors clinging to driftwood in a storm. The digital age brought new challenges, and with them, new opportunities. The old trades, heroin, gambling, extortion, were still there, but they were no longer enough. Cybercrime exploded across Asia, and both syndicates adapted in their own ways. The Triads exploited China's vast manufacturing base to produce counterfeit electronics and pharmaceuticals, flooding global markets with fake goods. The Yakuza tapped into Japan's advanced technology sector, investing in fraud schemes, online scams, and stock market manipulations. And when these new ventures overlapped, the same rule applied. Where collaboration brought profit, they cooperated. Where overlap threatened tension, they negotiated carefully to avoid open conflict. Yet the cracks deepened. The Triads, more fragmented than the Yakuza, struggled with internal rivalries. Different branches pursued different strategies, some willing to honor the old truce, others tempted to take risks for greater gain. The Yakuza, bound by their rigid hierarchy, found it easier to enforce discipline, but they too faced fractures as younger members questioned the value of maintaining traditions in an era when tattoos and rituals drew more police than respect. Betrayals followed. In the mid-2000s, a scandal erupted when a triad-connected smuggling ring was exposed in Japan, bypassing Yakuza intermediaries. It was a breach of the unwritten code, and the Yakuza's retaliation was inevitable. Several Chinese operatives vanished, their bodies rumored to have been dumped into Tokyo Bay. The incident came dangerously close to igniting the war both sides had long avoided. Meetings were held in Macau and Hong Kong, emissaries sent, apologies exchanged. The Triads promised discipline. The Yakuza, satisfied by the gesture, allowed the matter to close, but trust, once broken, is never fully restored. From then on, the peace carried an edge sharper than ever before. Meanwhile, the outside world was changing faster than either syndicate could keep up with. Globalization blurred borders, but it also empowered law enforcement to work together. Joint task forces linked agencies from China, Japan, the United States, and Europe. Drug shipments were intercepted, financial trails traced, assets frozen. Every year, it became harder to move money, harder to operate openly, harder to maintain the vast networks that had once seemed untouchable. The Triads and Yakuza adapted, but they were no longer the giants of old. Their names still carried weight, but their power was diminished, their legends fading into myth. And yet, the truce remained. It endured not because of loyalty, nor even mutual respect, but because it had become a necessity. In a world where both syndicates were fighting for survival, war would have been suicide. The Triads and the Yakuza knew this. They had known it for decades, and so, even as the years wore them down, they held to the same calculation: profit over war, silence over spectacle, survival over pride. Today, the legend of their uneasy peace lingers like smoke. The Triads, fractured but still alive, operate in the shadows of cities from Hong Kong to Vancouver. The Yakuza, diminished by law but not destroyed, remain woven into Japan's underground economy. Their paths still cross, their interests still overlap, and the ghost of their alliance still whispers in the corners of back rooms where deals are made. But the world has changed. They are no longer untouchable, no longer kings of the shadows. And perhaps that is the final irony. For all the fear their names inspired, for all the myths of blood-soaked streets and endless rivalry, the true story of the Triads and the Yakuza is one of restraint. They built empires not on the wars they fought, but on the wars they chose not to fight. They endured because they understood that bullets end lives, but money builds legacies. And in that cold calculation, they found a kind of peace. Imagine it now, a dim room somewhere in East Asia. Two aging men seated across from each other. One is a Triad elder, his hair gray, his body weakened by years of violence and exile. The other is a Yakuza patriarch, his suit immaculate, his tattoos faded beneath wrinkled skin. Between them lies not a map of conquest, but a quiet understanding. They do not speak of brotherhood. They do not pretend to trust. They know their time is ending, that the world outside has grown too fast, too sharp, too connected for men like them. But still, as their eyes meet, there is no hate, only recognition. The recognition of predators who chose long ago not to devour each other. The end. And so their story closes, not with the roar of gunfire, but with the silence of a truce that outlived expectation. A truce forged in shadows, kept alive by necessity, and remembered as one of the strangest truths of the underworld, that sometimes the deadliest rivals find that peace, however uneasy, is the most profitable business of all. The 1980s and 1990s were the years when shadows grew taller than skyscrapers. Neon lights illuminated deals that were never written on paper, and entire cities seemed to hum with the quiet rhythm of organized crime. The Triads and the Yakuza, once thought of as eternal enemies, were instead architects of a strange kind of peace. But peace in their world was never silence. It was a constant negotiation, a delicate balancing act in which money replaced gunfire and the language of respect drowned out the growl of violence. The Triads had perfected their grip on Hong Kong, a city that pulsed like the heartbeat of global trade. Every alley seemed to carry whispers of gambling dens, protection rackets, or backroom deals. In Macau, the casinos spun fortunes into the pockets of men whose names never appeared on government rosters. In Chinatowns from San Francisco to London, invisible threads connected shopkeepers to men in smoky rooms thousands of miles away. Across the sea, the Yakuza maintained their own world, carved into the flesh of Japan's cities like tattoos that couldn't be erased. Tokyo's nightlife was theirs, from the red light districts of Kabukicho to the boardrooms of corporations that pretended not to see the hands feeding them. Construction contracts, entertainment businesses, real estate booms, all carried the faint fingerprints of the syndicates. But where their power truly intersected was in the silent corridors of international trade. Shipping containers became the lifeblood of both groups, carrying goods, both legal and illegal, hidden among toys, electronics, and foodstuffs. A container unloaded in Yokohama might carry timber on its manifest, but heroin sealed inside its walls. Another docked in Hong Kong might claim to carry textiles but contain weapons or smuggled humans. The key was not brute force, but networks of trust and cooperation. Triads had the suppliers, Yakuza had the distribution channels, both had the money laundering systems to make dirty fortunes clean. It would be wrong to think of this cooperation as friendship. At its heart, it was pragmatic survival. Both groups had faced mounting pressure from governments that were slowly learning the art of global policing. The United States launched campaigns against Asian drug routes. Japanese police increased crackdowns on Yakuza activity, stripping away their carefully maintained semi-legitimacy. In Hong Kong, colonial authorities, soon to hand the city back to China, fought endlessly to control Triad operations. With heat building on every side, a full-scale war between syndicates would have been suicide. Business demanded something cooler, something smarter. The uneasy peace was written in rituals and gestures more than words. A Yakuza envoy arriving in Hong Kong would be greeted not as an honored guest, but as a respected equal. He would be taken to a restaurant, perhaps one hidden behind an unmarked door in Mongkok, where banquets stretched into the night. Faces were studied carefully, tones weighed for sincerity. A wrong phrase could cause offense. A careless joke could spark suspicion. But if all went well, deals were cemented with toasts of fiery liquor and promises that were binding not because of law, but because of reputation. To break one's word in this world was to sign one's own death warrant, not through bullets, but through the slow suffocation of dishonor. The business of peace was not limited to narcotics. Both syndicates had a keen eye for legitimate ventures that could hide their darker profits. Casinos in Macau became joint playgrounds. The construction booms of Tokyo and Osaka offered endless contracts that could be manipulated, inflated, and skimmed. Nightclubs became both profit centers and meeting points, buzzing with music, while men at back tables drew invisible maps of influence. Even the film industry, especially in Hong Kong during its golden era, carried shadows behind the cameras, with Triads investing in productions and occasionally leaning on actors or directors to cooperate. The Yakuza did the same in Japan, tying themselves to talent agencies and entertainment companies. To the outside world, it seemed impossible that groups so steeped in criminal identity could coexist without constant clashes. But to the insiders, the truth was simple. Violence had a price, and that price was bad for business. A gunfight in the streets drew police, closed down operations, and scared away investors. A quiet arrangement, on the other hand, ensured steady cash flow. It was the logic of corporations applied to the underworld, mergers instead of takeovers, partnerships instead of destruction. Yet, beneath the surface, the tension never fully disappeared. The Triads distrusted the Yakuza's rigid hierarchy, the way an Oyabun could command total obedience from his men. The Yakuza, in turn, viewed the Triads as too loose, too fractured, a web of families and cliques that could not always be controlled from the top. Cooperation worked best at the higher levels where bosses understood the stakes. But on the streets, foot soldiers sometimes let tempers flare. A deal gone wrong, a slight insult, a disputed territory. It could all ignite into small skirmishes. These skirmishes, however, rarely spread. Both organizations had learned to stamp out fires before they became infernos. By the mid-1990s, globalization was accelerating, and with it came new opportunities. Triads looked westward, expanding into Vancouver, Los Angeles, and Sydney, while Yakuza strengthened their reach into financial systems and technology firms. The world was shrinking, and with each shrinking mile, cooperation became more important. Borders mattered less. Supply chains mattered more. Together, the syndicates wove an invisible net across oceans, catching profits that legitimate businesses could only envy. Still, the fragile truce faced new challenges. Law enforcement agencies began sharing intelligence across borders. The Drug Enforcement Administration in the United States tracked shipments that linked Southeast Asian suppliers to Japanese distributors. Interpol created databases that listed names once considered untouchable. The Chinese government, preparing to reclaim Hong Kong in 1997, began tightening its grip on Triad operations. And in Japan, public tolerance for the Yakuza waned, leading to harsher crackdowns and the erosion of the once semi-legal status the groups enjoyed. It was in this climate that the philosophy of profit over war was tested most severely. Some leaders argued that pressure from authorities made cooperation more vital than ever. Others whispered that old loyalties and rivalries could resurface under strain. Yet, time and again, when the choice came down to bullets or banknotes, the banknotes won. The Triads and Yakuza understood that their survival lay not in spectacular shows of dominance, but in invisibility. The best crime, after all, was the crime no one noticed. Imagine a boardroom in Tokyo's Shinjuku district. The men inside wear dark suits, their hair neatly styled, their tattoos hidden beneath fabric. To a casual observer, it could be any corporate meeting, but the language of business being spoken is different. Numbers tied to casinos, shipping routes hidden in coded phrases, names of suppliers never written down but passed orally across the table. A similar scene plays out in Hong Kong, where a restaurant's private room holds men of equal stature. There are no written contracts between them, only nods, handshakes, and the weight of reputations that stretch back generations. The peace between Triads and Yakuza was not born of kindness. It was not idealism nor the romantic brotherhood that films sometimes portray. It was cold, rational, and rooted in survival. To fight would be to lose. To cooperate was to endure. And in the world of organized crime, endurance meant everything. As the century drew toward its end, both groups found themselves facing questions they had not asked before. Could the old code survive in a new millennium? Could syndicates born of feudal loyalty and revolutionary oaths adapt to a world where money flowed instantly? Surveillance cameras watched every street, and governments were no longer blind to the games being played in the shadows. For Triads and Yakuza alike, the answer lay in the same principle that had guided their uneasy peace for decades. As long as there was profit to be made, war could wait. And so, the strange alliance held, not carved in stone, but whispered in smoke-filled rooms, carried across oceans by ships whose manifests told lies, and maintained by men who knew that silence was the most valuable commodity of all. The 20th century ended not with a bang, but with a quiet reshuffling of the underworld. Cities that had once seemed like fortresses for syndicates began to change in ways that neither Triad nor Yakuza bosses had fully anticipated. The old rituals, the carefully drawn maps of power, the unspoken agreements of peace, they all remained. But they were being tested by forces greater than rival gangs. The world itself was shifting, and the shadows had to shift with it. In Japan, the Yakuza faced an identity crisis. For decades, they had lived in a strange gray zone, openly occupying offices, printing business cards, and even running companies with their insignia on display. Their tattoos and missing fingers marked them as dangerous, but they were also strangely respectable in their way. Guardians of a warped kind of order in neighborhoods where ordinary citizens looked the other way. But the Japanese government, prodded by public outrage and embarrassed by international scrutiny, began closing the space in which the Yakuza had thrived. Laws were rewritten to deny them access to banking. Companies were pressured to cut ties. Even renting an apartment became difficult. The semi-legitimate empire that had once shielded them began to crumble, leaving many Yakuza members without the protection of tradition or the shield of fear. The Triads faced their own upheaval. Hong Kong, long their playground, was returned to Chinese rule in 1997. Overnight, The political landscape changed. The colonial system that had allowed certain syndicates to operate with a measure of freedom was gone, replaced by a government that had little patience for organizations it considered destabilizing. Crackdowns intensified. Surveillance grew sharper. Networks that had once operated with impunity now had to burrow deeper into shadows. Yet the Triads, more fractured and fluid than the Yakuza, adapted with the same opportunism that had guided them for centuries. Some shifted into human trafficking, others into counterfeit goods, still others into cybercrime. The dragon bent, but it did not break. As globalization accelerated, the underworld grew both larger and harder to control. The heroin roots of the Golden Triangle still pumped poison across continents, but they were joined by methamphetamines, cocaine, and synthetic drugs cooked in anonymous labs. Triads controlled many of these flows, but they no longer had exclusive command. Competition rose from smaller gangs, from international cartels, from new players who cared nothing for honor codes. The Yakuza, too, discovered that their old methods were being undercut by ruthless organizations without history or scruples. Where once their tattoos commanded respect, now they marked them for police attention. The world had grown too crowded for rituals to shield them. And yet, through all this, the strange peace between Triads and Yakuza endured. Even as both groups weakened in the face of modern pressures, they clung to the logic that had prevented bloodshed in the past. Fighting each other would only accelerate their decline. Cooperation, however limited, offered survival. Their networks continued to overlap in smuggling routes, in money laundering operations, in the movement of people and goods that governments struggled to track. The peace was thinner now, more fragile, but it still held because the alternative was ruin. In quiet rooms in Tokyo, old Oyabun looked at younger men with unease. The new recruits were different, less bound to tradition, more hungry for quick profits. They questioned the long rituals, the elaborate codes of conduct, the notion of loyalty above self. Some left the Yakuza altogether, splintering into loosely organized gangs with no sense of the old discipline. In Hong Kong and Guangzhou, Triad elders faced similar dilemmas. The new generation embraced cybercrime, hacking, and scams that could be executed with a laptop rather than a knife. To the veterans, it felt like betrayal of the old ways, but to the youth, it was evolution. Honor codes did not pay. Digital theft did. And still, in the whispers of back alleys and the private rooms of restaurants, the legends of both syndicates survived. A young hacker might not know the full oath of loyalty, but he would still bow to a Triad elder if called. A street dealer in Osaka might not wear tattoos, but he knew better than to insult the Yakuza name in certain districts. The shadows had thinned, but they had not vanished. Law enforcement celebrated victories, and indeed, there were many. Major drug busts dismantled networks that had operated for decades. Casinos, once dominated by syndicates, were placed under tighter controls. International cooperation made it harder for money to vanish into hidden accounts. But the truth of organized crime is that it does not disappear. It mutates. The same ingenuity that once turned gamblers into a brotherhood, that once transformed secret societies into criminal empires, now drove syndicates into newer, subtler domains. Technology became the new battleground. The Internet opened doors no bullet could close. It is tempting to think of this story as one of decline, as if the Triads and Yakuza are fading into history, leaving behind only tattoos, movies, and myths. And in a way, it is true. Their power today is not what it once was. They no longer command entire cities with the same impunity. Governments are more watchful, societies less tolerant. But legends do not vanish easily. The very names still carry weight, still inspire fear or fascination, still serve as warnings whispered to those who might cross unseen lines. And the business of peace, the logic that profit is greater than war, remains as true as ever. Even in decline, even under pressure, both groups understood that their greatest strength was not in violence, but in restraint. They proved that the underworld, like the overworld, follows the simple rules of survival. Do not waste resources on battles you cannot win. Do not destroy what feeds you. Do not let pride bankrupt you. In that sense, their uneasy alliance across decades was not just a criminal strategy, but a lesson in pragmatism. Imagine, for a moment, one last scene, a private room in a dimly lit restaurant in Macau, perhaps in the early 2000s. At the table sit men who no longer hold the same power they once did, their hair grayer, their shoulders stooped. They speak softly, not in grand speeches, but in murmurs. One mentions a new route for smuggling electronics. Another talks about counterfeit pharmaceuticals. A third warns of police stings. They nod, sip their tea, and agree. No raised voices, no threats, no boasts. Just an understanding that the world has changed, but the principle remains. To fight is to lose. To work together, however quietly, is to survive a little longer. The Triads and the Yakuza, two ancient syndicates born of rebellion and poverty, carry their shadows into the modern age not through conquest, but through restraint. They discovered long ago that peace, however fragile, was more profitable than war. And so their story does not end with the roar of gunfire, but with the whisper of deals struck in silence, the shuffle of money through hidden channels, and the knowledge that even in decline, the shadows remain. Their legends, like bedtime stories, will outlive them. Children will grow up hearing tales of dragons and chrysanthemums, of men with inked skin and missing fingers, of secret oaths and whispered promises. They will imagine wars that never happened, blood feuds that never burned as hot as the myths claim. But those who lived in the real underworld will remember the truth, that the greatest power these syndicates ever wielded was not the ability to destroy, but the discipline to refrain, to choose profit over pride, survival over glory. And so the curtain falls on the long dance between Triads and Yakuza, not with a final battle, but with an enduring lesson. In the kingdom of shadows, peace was always the greater weapon. And so the tale drifts into silence. The Triads and the Yakuza remain, less visible now, less certain, yet never gone. They exist like faint shadows on the walls of modern cities, reminders of an era when codes of loyalty and profit shaped entire empires. The wars people expected never truly came, because the clever ones knew that wealth outlasts vengeance. Perhaps one day the last of their names will vanish into history. But until then, the story endures, whispered at night like all the best bedtime stories, of rivals who found peace not out of love, but because peace paid better.